Whatever you have here is unholy and must be destroyed.
What's up, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. My name is Kenny, and I am here with my good friend Stefan. How are you doing tonight?
Fantastic.
Good. We were just getting out all of our giggles, which is how we get ready for
We're a very giggly bunch tonight.
Yeah. But what we're talking about tonight is not a giggling matter. It is a very sad episode tonight. But before we get into it, I want to let you guys know that we have a Patreon set up. It's only $3 a month. And if you join, we have extra content basically coming your way. We're going to have the first extra content episode coming tomorrow. And also, if you enjoy what we do, please like and subscribe to the videos. We release every week, shorter videos and longer ones every other week. So it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, I think like the content we upload to the Patreon too is a little bit more lighthearted, at least for what we have planned for now. That could change, but it's us just hanging out for now.
Yep. Yeah, so I mean, today we are talking about, as you know by the thumbnail, Heaven's Gate, the Heaven's Gate cult. And it's a huge one. It's something that both of us really like. It's something that I've been really into for a very long time, way before the podcast ever started. And I just wanted to sort of start off by saying that this is a really, really big case, and there's a lot of information on this case out there in the world today on the internet. And with how we release episodes, which is every week, there's no way that we can go into every single aspect of this case. There is just way too much to actually go into. So, today we're going to give you a general overview and commentary of Heaven's Gate. But if you, after you listen to this, and if you really like it, we implore you to dig deeper and, really go into it, because you can go down a rabbit hole for a very long time with this case.
Yeah, and let us know what we miss.
Yeah, exactly. If we miss something, whatever, if there's anything that you know about the case that we didn't say that's interesting, please leave it in the comments below, because we always wanted to start a discussion. So yeah, today's story starts on March 22nd, 1997. This would be one of the biggest mass suicides in American history. And technically, some people call it the biggest suicide in American history. It is the biggest mass suicide on American soil, but Jonestown actually killed, way more people. Within 4 days of March 22nd, 1997, 39 members of the UFO religious cult Heaven's Gate would be dead in a 9,200 square foot mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, California. 21 women and 18 men. What exactly was going on inside this house? What led to this massacre? And can we call this a mass suicide? Or like the Jonestown incident, do some consider this to be a mass murder? Today we're going to go over the details of this case, and we're going to go over their leader's life and how he was able to convince so many people to do this.
Marshall Applewhite was born in Spur, Texas on May 17th, 1931. Spur is a small city with only a population of about 1,300. He was a junior, so his father was Marshall Applewhite Sr., and his mother was Louise Applewhite. Marshall had 3 siblings. His father was a Presbyterian minister, and this would obviously have a pretty big impact on his life, as he became very religious from an early age. Marshall attended Corpus Christi High School and went to Austin College. Even from a young age, he was very involved with different student organizations and religious ones as well. In 1952, he earned a bachelor's degree in philosophy and would enroll at Union Presbyterian Seminary to study theology. It seems like he was trying to follow his father's footsteps in becoming a minister. During this time, he would meet Ann Pierce and would eventually have 2 children, named Lane and Mark. He would leave school to pursue music, and he would eventually become a music director for a North Carolina Presbyterian church. However, in 1954, Marshall would be drafted by the U.S. Army and would serve in Austria and New Mexico. He was a member of the Army Signal Corps. In 1956, he left the military and enrolled in college again, this time at the University of Colorado, where he would eventually earn his master's degree in music. After finishing his master's degree in Colorado, he would move to New York City, where he was going to attempt to become a professional singer. This would not work out. So then he moved to Alabama, and he would teach at the University of Alabama. However, eventually this position at the university would not last long either. When he was found out to be having a same-sex relationship with a male student, he was fired. And when his wife found out about the affair, they separated in 1965 and divorced 3 years later. After all of this, he would move to Houston, Texas, and in 1965 would secure a teaching job at the University of St. Thomas teaching music. He served as the chair for the music department, and he would leave his job claiming that he was depressed. Some speculate that it could have been another failed relationship with a student that forced him to quit. After moving to New Mexico in 1971 for a bit, he would return to Texas that same year. At this point, his father died, and he was having very real financial trouble, forcing him into a deeper depression and making him borrow money from his friends.
Yeah, so at this point, he's in his 30s, and he's already been around a lot of, he's been around the world. He went to Austria, so that's, he's been outside of America, and he's been to different cities in America. He's Colorado, back and forth from Texas, New Mexico, and seems like a pretty intelligent person. Maybe doesn't know what's going on in his life, but, he's gifted musically. He can sing, and, he's trying to make a life out of that. So,
and he's definitely gay, Matt. Like, that's a very common theme throughout this story, will be that he was a gay man suppressing probably quite a bit.
A little bit. I think we'll get a little more into that. He would suppress it because he kind of had to, but there were points in his life where he was very out about being bisexual, for sure. Well, I think he was gay. I mean, he only had real sexual relationships with men for his entire life. He had relationships with women, but they were said to have been less sexual, more platonic. So the next year, in 1972, Marshall would meet Bonnie Nettles in a hospital in Houston, Texas. Bonnie was working there as a nurse, and Bonnie believed that she had the ability to read the stars and talk to the dead, and she would do this. She would use her powers to help friends and family, and she truly believed that she was helping them. Marshall was very lost in this time of his life, and, he knew that God had chosen him, but he wasn't sure exactly for what. Bonnie was the missing piece of the puzzle. They would become very close friends, and they would even conclude that they had met in a past life. Bonnie was married with 2 kids, and even though the relationship that Marshall and Bonnie had was platonic, it became much too strange for her husband to deal with, and also it became much stronger than her and her husband ever had. They would get a divorce, Bonnie and her husband, and Bonnie would lose custody of her children. And around this time, Marshall would also completely break off contact with his family. They both believed each other to be soulmates, and they both really started to dive deep into religious alternatives to Christianity. Bonnie told Marshall that aliens had foretold that they would meet. Marshall would also more than likely have a schizophrenic episode during this time and claim that he was chosen for a role like that of Jesus Christ. Marshall and Bonnie would eventually open a bookstore, selling spiritual books, and they would also create a venture known as the No Place, which would teach classes on mysticism and theosophy. Both of these businesses would close, and after this, in 1973, they would decide to start traveling around the Southwest and Western United States to teach others about their beliefs. The travels would be hard, and they would constantly be broke, sometimes working odd jobs to buy very little food and lodging. And in May of 1974, a friend of Marshall and Bonnie's reached out to them from Texas named Sharon, and this friend would accept their teachings. They would visit her, and she would become their first convent. She wouldn't last long, but she was the first. And yeah, at this point, honestly, we really have to stress that these two were very, very close. And again, they were having a platonic relationship, so they weren't, they weren't having sex. They weren't, a couple. They weren't together like that. But they were extremely close. And also, I want to say, before we go any further, that they had different nicknames throughout their lives, throughout the time that they were, that they did everything. So obviously his name is Marshall, and her name is Bonnie, but they would go by Doe and T. They would go by Bo and Peep, respectively. But throughout this episode, we're just gonna say Marshall and Bonnie because I think it makes it easier, instead of switching back and forth between names. And but they did go through different nicknames, and
By June of 1974, their beliefs had started to take more of a solid shape. They started to actually have an outline on what they wanted to teach. They believed that they had been chosen to fulfill biblical prophecies and that they were higher-minded, on a higher-minded level than other humans. They believed and wrote in a pamphlet that they would later hand out that Jesus had been reincarnated as a Texan, of course, who resembled Marshall and was Marshall. They would also write that they were two witnesses that were referenced in the book of Revelation. Sometimes they would visit spiritual groups and other churches to convey this message, but it was never received well, as you can imagine.
Yeah, no.
In August of 1974, Marshall would be brought back to St. Louis, Missouri, and jailed for 6 months for failing to return a rental car. He claimed to have the divine authority to keep the car, which rules. I wish I could use that. Man, such a good excuse.
Like whenever they arrest you and they're like, "Well, you haven't returned the car in 6 months. Don't worry about it. Yeah. I have divine
Sir, have
authority.
You heard of God, officer?" Yeah.
That's me.
That's me.
Okay.
So the 6 months he would spend in jail would give him plenty of time to continue solidifying his beliefs and that he would eventually incorporate into the group. After his release, Marshall and Bonnie would continue traveling. They would focus on contacting aliens and would now start to actively find people to join the group. They published advertisements for meetings, and they would attempt to convert people at these meetings. They claimed to represent beings from another planet. They would tell converts that the planet was looking for humans to take part of an experiment, and that anyone who would want to take part in this experiment would be brought to a higher evolutionary level. They would initially name this group Anonymous Sexaholics Celibate Church, which is... That's not real, dude.
This whole, everything you've been saying is just, it makes me want to laugh. Like when you said they would focus on contacting aliens. It's like, how do you have any idea on how hard that would be? I mean,
that can't be
I guess,
real, dude.
the idea is that she's doing it with her mind, right? As far as contacting aliens. But, yeah, Anonymous Sexaholic Celibate Church.
I have to say that again. I couldn't even get that out the first time. Anonymous Sexaholic Celibate Church. What a mouthful.
That's a cool name, though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, no one knows what it means, but
Yeah.
It sounds great. They would eventually settle on human individual metamorphosis. HIM. I
Sounds like
it.
a rock album name from the 90s.
It's a great band. In 1975, the two were now going by Bo and Peep. They set up meetings in California and in Oregon and were able to secure 80 members to leave their normal lives and follow the group. The group started to get negative publicity around this time as well.
Yeah, because they're going around calling themselves Anonymous Sexaholics Celibate Church.
When they're also starting to fuse science fiction with Christianity, so it's getting wonky. You're I'm sure real Christians would say you're perverting the faith or whatever.
Yeah, but even more conservative Christians were definitely feeling that way about them. But honestly, even the other alternative Christian groups were also outcasting. Like Marshall and Bonnie, they weren't even good enough for the other mysticism alternative Christian groups that were out there.
They were the original Ancient Aliens people.
That's actually very true. When you actually go into what they believed, that is what they believe.
We need to show a picture of the guy.
Yeah.
Cue it now.
All right. So by this time in 1975, they had somehow 70 to 80 followers. And the group really started to take shape as a cult. Marshall, and I say that, I don't know. At that point, that's just what it seemed like. Obviously, I mean, they have 70 or 80 people just following them around, preaching this crazy stuff about UFO religious stuff. Marshall would say that complete separation of earthly desires was 100% essential to ascend to the next evolutionary level. Members had to give up everything that wasn't to do with the cult: family, friends, media, drugs, alcohol, facial hair, sexuality, jewelry, everything. They were also required to take on more biblical names, and also more what's the word? Science fiction names as well. I mean, everyone, all the members had to change their names.
And they were the weirdest names. And may I say, this is just my opinion, I think it was lazy what they Dave Odie, Al Odie.
Everyone had to have Odie at the end of their names. And there was one guy named Tall Odie because he was tall.
Come on, we can do better.
That's literally what it was.
We have to do better.
This guy's name was Tall Odie because he was high.
Who was in charge of that? That was a misstep. That was the first misstep.
Yeah. So after April of 1975, Marshall and Bonnie would not have any more public meetings, though. They would typically stay in remote campgrounds, and they wouldn't speak about their beliefs as much as they used to. It seems like this had a lot to do with the fact that they thought they were being publicly assassinated, like as far as their public identities. No one really liked them. And like any true cult, they believed that the entire world was out to get them. And throughout this period, naturally, some of the people in the group would decide that it was getting a little bit too crazy and they left. Anyone that left, per the norm for this sort of thing, would be cut off completely. So in June of 1976, they gathered their remaining followers at Medicine Bow National Forest, I believe that's right, in southeastern Wyoming, promising a UFO visit. The UFO didn't show up. And after this, this failing, they basically just said that it had been canceled, that the UFO visit had been canceled. For the next 3 years, the group would live throughout the Rocky Mountains and in Texas remote campgrounds. I wonder if they've ever been to Big Bend.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah. During this period, Marshall and Bonnie would become increasingly restrictive on the control they had over their members. They would basically become fully dominant over them, and they wouldn't allow them to speak to anyone on the outside, any family, friends, nothing about that. And the thing about it is, it's like when you think about it like this, like they were very restrictive on what they would allow members to do, but if you talk to the members, and this is kind of where we get into the quote-unquote brainwashing aspect of this, they all thought that Marshall especially, but they loved they loved both Marshall and Bonnie, and they thought Marshall was like this super humble, like non-human being who was just perfect, and it's pretty interesting like how they got to be that way. I mean,
yeah, and I mean the guy was charismatic, but when you hear him talk, you don't really like. The one thing you really get is that his gaze is super creepy. Like he had this sort of like entrancing stare about him. It's definitely a schizophrenia stare.
His eyes, man, were
in
just
retrospect.
Like,
yeah, you can tell a lot's going on.
Yeah.
At some point in the late 1970s, the group would receive a large sum of money, which is said to have come in the form of an inheritance from a member of the cult. They also worked jobs, usually working on computers, and I know that there was a few web designers in the group as well.
Yeah, and that happened more in the 90s, but in the 70s it was they did a lot of just odd jobs. And honestly, when I swear I tried to look into how they specifically received the amount of money they did receive, and I couldn't find anything. Like I couldn't find anything specifically showing that they had received enough money to do what they were doing. Especially later in the group's life.
If you can convert 80 people, you can come up with some money. You know what I mean? Somebody's getting paid. So they would use this money to get away from campgrounds and get into homes. And usually they would have a couple homes all at the same time, some for the members, and then they would have a house for the leaders, obviously. Any of the members who weren't comfortable living this type of lifestyle were actually encouraged to leave. So Marshall was essentially just trying to weed out the people who weren't willing to put up with the conditions he was putting them in.
Yeah, exactly.
And so basically what he wanted was this is a weird way to say it, but a quality. He wanted a person he was able to mold. So it wasn't necessarily the quantity of people he was looking for, but he needed people that would follow his every word.
Yeah, which is pretty much the opposite of what like Jonestown did. I mean, what I've said about this for a long time is, it was like Heaven's Gate didn't have as many people because they started off kind of insane from the very beginning. Jonestown did not. If anyone doesn't know what Jonestown was, I'm sure everyone who's listening to this does. Look it up. But Jonestown started off as a church, as a very normal, open, loving, forgiving church, and that had thousands of members, and it just went downhill from there. And this is not how Heaven's Gate was. Heaven's Gate started off really crazy, and he wanted someone, like Stefan said, who could just take over and control them.
In 1982, it would seem that they would relax some of their control a little bit and allow members to call their families. In 1983, some members were allowed to visit their families during Mother's Day, but they were told to tell their families that they were studying computers at a monastery.
Yeah, and there's a tape of one of the members calling, I believe her name was Gail, but I can't remember it off the top of my head. It could have been something else.
KOOL-AID?
No. No, but there's a videotape of, or not a videotape, but an audio tape of this, one of the members calling her parents, and the parents had recorded the conversation, and they are like low-key trying to convince her to come home and visit without scaring her off. But it would be the last time that they ever talked to her. But
so sad.
So they were letting people call home, but not visiting too much. Like I said, maybe, or like Stefan said on Mother's Day. But
how nice of them.
Yeah.
So years before this, Bonnie was actually diagnosed with cancer, and in 1983, she had to have an eye surgically removed. 2 years after this, in 1985, Bonnie would die from cancer. Bonnie believed that the doctor that had removed her eye and that had told her the cancer was spreading everywhere was ignorant.
I'm not trying to laugh. It's just she has cancer, and there's a doctor like, that's performing surgery on her, and she's like, he's ignorant.
Yeah, shut up, quack.
Yeah.
She died after the cancer had moved to her liver. Marshall had been able to convince the rest of the group that Bonnie had simply traveled to the next level because she had, quote, too much energy to remain on Earth. Only one member left because of this. Marshall became very depressed after Bonnie died, and the rest of the group members were the ones to continue to encourage him to keep going on. Previous to Bonnie dying, Marshall had told his group that their souls would leave the humanly world and go onto a spaceship that would take them to a higher level. But he had to change.
Yeah.
He said that the ascension to the next level could be spiritual in nature if the, quote, vehicle was too damaged to go on. And Marshall believed that he would teach that the biblical heaven was actually on another planet that held highly evolved beings, basically. And the members would get a new physical body once there. I should mention as well here, after Bonnie died, he didn't tell any of her kids. Mm-hmm. So her kids would find out, years later, that their mother was actually dead. And one of her kids was 2 hours away from her. So they could have visited her in the hospital. Totally sad. She died alone.
The thing about Bonnie's death is it really screwed up his plan at the time. I mean, again, like you said, only one person left because of this. I mean, he didn't make any sense with what he was saying. I mean, this entire time, he said that they would physically leave. Like, whenever they were going to go to the next level, their bodies would be taken with them. But when Bonnie died, it really screwed that up. So he had to come up with something and come up with it quick. And luckily, only one, or not luckily, I mean, luckily for him, but unfortunately, only one person left at the time. But so, yeah, after Bonnie's death, Marshall began to become even less trustful in the government and began to speak more about the end of the world. The group was already not really letting in new members at this time, but at this point, they were even stricter about this, and any kind of communication with the outside was, forbidden. So they weren't doing anything. So let's get into the actual belief system a little bit. We haven't really went over it very much. We were just kind of going over Marshall and Bonnie and how they met in the beginnings of the actual group. So Heaven's Gate members believed that Earth would be recycled before 2027. They believed that to survive this, they would have to leave their earthly bodies as a group at a time when it was correct. Now, not necessarily as a group. I said as a group. I mean, it could be done separately, but it was all going to be done at about the same time because you couldn't just go at any point. I mean, unless you're Bonnie. I don't know. That's what they said. This would be called entering the next level, which was the evolutionary level above human. Again, like we went over, Bonnie's death really changed how this was supposedly done. They believed that to be eligible for membership to the next level, humans would have to shred every attachment to the planet. This meant, again, all members had to give up all human-like characteristics, such as we went over it before: family, friends, sexuality, jobs, money, maybe not jobs, but like careers, money, possessions, all that kind of stuff. Marshall and Bonnie would believe and teach that they were aliens who had a clean slate, unlike humans. To actually graduate to the next level, 4 steps would have to actually take place. So basically, once you were going to transcend to the next level, you would be physically picked up onto a spacecraft and transferred to the next level aboard that craft. That basically the craft would take you there. The craft would descend to Earth, collect Applewhite, Bonnie, and their followers, and their human bodies would transform through biological and chemical processes to perfected beings. This would change after Bonnie's death, again. And this is why they were known as a UFO religion, because to transcend to the next level, it was actually done on a UFO. Natural death, accidental death, or death from random violence are ways of doing it as well. Here, the graduating soul leaves the human container to a perfected next-level body. So if you get in a car accident and you die, they're just going to assume that you've gone on. Outside persecution that leads to death as well. So after the deaths of the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas, and the events involving Randy Weaver at Ruby Ridge. By the way, we've done that episode. It's one of our least viewed episodes. It's one of my favorites. Go back and listen to it. Marshall was afraid the American government would murder the members of Heaven's Gate. And that was a very real threat. I mean, obviously, they were afraid the ATF would just come in and take them out. Willful exit from the body in a dignified manner was another way. So this is what would end up happening. Near the end, Marshall had a revelation that they might have to abandon their human bodies and achieve the next level as Jesus had done. This occurred on March 22nd and 23rd, when 39 members died by suicide and graduated. And actually, it wasn't just the 22nd and 23rd. It started on the 22nd and actually went over 3 or 4 days. We'll go deeper into that in a minute. They also had, all the members had to carry a $5 bill and 1 roll of quarters on them at all times. And this was said, the quarters were said to have been carried on them because if they had to make a phone call, they would have change to go to a payphone and make a phone call. And the $5 bill supposedly was on them. When I was growing up, I always heard it was for I always heard it was for intergalactic fare, but that's not it. It was because they were afraid of the cops, and whenever they were out and about, I guess they were accused of being vagrants. So they would show them the $5 bill and say, "Hey, I'm not homeless. I have money."
It was a different time in America, clearly.
I don't know. If anyone's ever heard me, that's just what I've read. If anyone's heard something different about that, let me know. But when I was growing up, every, everything. I kept reading online. This is just fake stuff, but I kept reading online that they would carry money around for intergalactic fare. I swear to God, I've read that so many
strange.
times. I actually thought that's what it was, but then reading it this time, it's like I couldn't actually find anything that said that. So maybe I just made that up in my head.
That's weird.
Yeah.
By the late 1980s, the group went pretty silent, but they did mail documents detailing exactly what they believed to New Age organizations in 1988. And this document detailed the history of the group and would also advise people to read several books. These books focused on Christian history and the UFOs. After this, they would be silent for 4 years. In 1992, the group released a 12-part video series which was broadcast around the world. Now, during the entire history of the group, hundreds of people had come and gone, and by the early 1990s, only 26 were left, and this was probably like the lowest point. In May of 1993, the group would change its name to Total Overcomers Anonymous, which doesn't really, I mean, Heaven's Gate is so much cooler.
Well, they haven't had Heaven's Gate technically yet.
Sure. Right. But so they would spend $30,000 to publish an entire page ad in USA Today. This ad would warn of an apocalyptic event to end Earth. You know, tell me something I don't know.
Yeah.
You know, that's every cult.
Yeah, I mean, and this is what's crazy is they spent $30,000 on an entire page ad in USA Today. I mean, like, where the hell do they get this money from? I'm sorry. I mean, everyone's working jobs, and by this point, like you said earlier, by this point they're all working. They're all working jobs, or most of them are working jobs, or a lot of them are working web developer jobs too. And this is right at the beginning of when that was starting to boom. So, I mean, they were definitely making money.
They have to be like one of the earliest cults to sort of like
they
get converts through the internet. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. And they were definitely they were really smart about making money, obviously. I mean, at some point. I mean, I think, again, they had capital coming in from somewhere, which helped them out a lot. But I feel like in the 90s, they were making pretty good money.
Yeah, they were making websites because, a couple of the members were web developers. They were making websites for a whole bunch of companies.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And by the way, the Heaven's Gate website is still up. You can go and check it out. It's horrible. It's very dated, but
heavensgate.com.
people are still paying the fees to keep it up. So pretty interesting. So they would take out that entire page ad in USA Today, and this ad would warn of an apocalyptic event. And this ad actually got 20 former members to rejoin the group. And by the early 1990s, the group's size had doubled. It was around this time the group would change their name yet again to Heaven's Gate. Marshall would be a bit less strict with his members' lives, probably because he was insecure about them leaving. Marshall would also dive into the internet a little bit more and talk about his teachings. Yep. This would result in major backlash from an online community and would hit him pretty hard. It was also around this time in the early 1990s that Marshall first began to talk about the idea of suicide as a possible way of ascending to the next level.
Yeah, like we said before, suicide was never an option. It was never from the beginning. He never spoke of suicide. It was always, they would get to a point where they could leave and they would have to wait for a specific event that would allow them to transcend, but yeah, suicide was never really on the table until the early 1990s. And, just from looking at everything, it really seems like around this time, like Stefan said, Marshall was getting really insecure, or that's what it seemed like. He didn't want people to leave. They put out a $30,000 ad to bring people in after not doing that for a while, and he didn't want them to leave. And honestly, it seems like towards the end, his leadership, while people remained faithful to the end, it seemed like he wasn't as, he just wasn't as strict by himself. And, just kind of seemed like, just a little less just, dominant boss type, versus what he was in the beginning.
Right.
Which he was never like aggressive about it. I mean, everyone would say that he was very a gentle soul and he was humble. So it was never like some strict, crazy, screaming boss.
And
But like,
even hearing him talk to the members in his videos, you can tell the guy. I mean, it's hard to really say this, but you can tell he like cares for the people, right? He just has a whole bunch of bad ideas.
yeah, and who knows? It's really hard to know exactly what was going on inside his head.
Sure.
And what was going on inside all of their heads. Like, does he care about them? I mean, I don't know, because like, is he? I mean, I think he was.
It's easy to say he didn't, right? To make the argument, because everyone would eventually end up dying. But it's weird, like he formed all these connections with these people who helped him essentially grow his business, religion, whatever you want to call it, cult. And, these people had been with him for 20 years. He had like really good relationships with these people.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's not like Jonestown was. It's not like other cults. I mean, it's similar to Waco, but it's not that. Because I don't think Waco, for one thing, wasn't like this, as far as like, it's hard to even say really if Waco and the Branch Davidians, it's hard to say if like they were a cult, but they were, it's hard to say if they were really like a cult. That's a whole different thing to get into, but I don't know, this is different. He is obviously mentally ill, and so it's hard to say whether or not like, did he care about them or not? Because maybe he did, but he was very mentally ill.
Yeah, it's weird. I heard him too, in like his final little video presentation. He talks about suicide, and he basically would say something like, it's suicide if we don't leave this planet. It's suicide to like stay here, to be tortured on this earth. Yeah. So he started to like switch up his rhetoric, and very, very interesting.
Yeah. And I don't want us to sound sympathetic to him, because we're not at all. I mean, it's really hard to say when it comes to someone who's mentally ill, who is doing these things. Like, again, I don't want anyone in the comments to be like, how dare you guys say that, like, it's not his fault, whatever. I mean,
we're not saying
that. It's just, it's complicated to know exactly how he felt towards the end,
And looking at him, you just know something's up. I'm not saying you would know he's a schizophrenic, but just seeing his eyes, you just get weird vibes from this guy immediately.
It was weird.
Yeah.
So in 1995, the group had purchased a 40-acre lot in New Mexico, and they built a compound on this land. Marshall had been hoping to establish a monastery there, but his health was getting worse and he was getting older, and he believed that he had cancer at one point. And when the monastery failed, they would leave New Mexico and head for California. And one thing that was becoming a major issue within the group was the suppression of sexuality, to the point that Marshall and 7 other men would get surgically castrated. And there was always this issue of the suppression of sexuality in the group, but I say it was getting worse. I mean, I think it was always an issue, but it definitely became a really big issue towards the end, to where they were like, let's take care of this and just cut it off.
Yeah, so they flew down to Mexico, got castrated, and
one person did, in Mexico.
It's said to have believed, like, before they went and did it, they were, like, happy about it, stoked that they were going.
Well, they were stoked about everything. The whole time, they were just stoked about this.
Fair enough.
If you watch these people, man, if you watch their end videos, because they all made videos in the end. Like, Marshall made his final video, which you can find online, and then they all made videos saying farewell to their family, friends, whatever, just saying bye, that they were doing this thing, and they were all happy. There were some doubts, there were a little bit of doubts, but most of them, even the ones that had doubts, seemed very happy, and they seemed like they truly, truly believed in what they were about to do. So it was the month of October 1996, and Marshall's group had relocated to Rancho Santa Fe, California. It was here that they would rent a mansion they would call the monastery. This is after New Mexico. It was a 9,200 square foot home that they would pay $7,000 a month for. The group would also purchase alien abduction insurance, which would cover each person at $1 million for abduction, impregnation, or death by alien. Who the hell? I
Dude.
don't understand how this is even a thing.
If you're the insurance company, you're just like, yes, yes, queen. Please, we will sell you all of these.
We will sell you these. They're cheap, but buy a bunch of them. Like, it's going to happen.
Good.
And how do you...
Is that an act of God, technically?
I don't know. It's so strange. Okay, so like I said, Marshall would make a tape called Doe's Final Exit. This tape would speak of mass suicide, and he would claim that it was the only way to evacuate this Earth. He told the camera that there was to be a spacecraft trailing Comet Hale-Bopp. He claimed that the comet would represent the closure of Heaven's Gate. He said that he and 38 of his followers were to prepare for ritual suicide, and that this would allow their souls to get aboard the spacecraft. And there, the souls would be taken to the level of existence above human by the UFO. And like I said before, all members made similar tapes. So yeah, there was something I wanted to bring up about this. So like I just said, they believe that there was a UFO that was trailing behind Comet Hale-Bopp. And if anyone out there knows who Art Bell is, I'm sure that if you're listening to this right now and you know anything about Heaven's Gate or you know anything about anything and you were around in the 90s, Art Bell was a very famous he ran something called Coast to Coast, and it was a radio show. It was a nightly radio show, and he was very into conspiracy theories. And I used to listen to him. There was a bunch of really crazy episodes. I mean, there's this episode. This is a whole different story, so I won't go off onto it. There's this episode where this guy, just look him up. He does a bunch of crazy stuff. Anyways, he had begun talking about the comet Hale-Bopp, and he had a couple scientific figures come on the show and talk about how they were witnessing something that was very real and very large following the comet behind it. I can't think of the guy's name, but basically there was like some type of physicist who was looking at the comet saying that about 100,000 to 150,000 miles behind the comet was an object that was 4 times the size of Earth and was blocking out the stars and was following the comet towards Earth. So there was a member of Heaven's Gate who heard this, he listened to Art Bell. I'm sure a lot of them did. And he heard this and took this information to Marshall. And he said, hey, what about this? And Marshall was like, that sounds right. That must be our UFO. And that's how all of this came to be. So they found out about it because of Art Bell's show, basically saying that there was something behind the comet. And Marshall just ran with it.
The suicides took place over a course of 4 days between March 22nd and March 26th. 21 women and 18 men between the ages of 26 and 72 would take a mixture of phenobarbital mixed with pudding or applesauce, and they would take this with vodka as well. They would then immediately put a plastic bag over their heads and secure it shut. The 39 members were dressed identically in black shirts and sweatpants with black and white Nike shoes. Nike Decades, to be more specific.
They were repping the kicks.
Yeah, they're pretty sweet. They also had patches on their arms that read Heaven's Gate Away Team. Over the course of 3 days, 3 separate groups would kill themselves. The first group of 15, the second group of 15, and the third group of 9. So essentially, once the first 15 had, taken all their phenobarbital and died, the second group would then move them to their beds, get them all into position, and then put that ceremonial, iconic purple sheet over them, leaving their, feet sticking out.
Yeah, exactly. And, like you said before, they sent out, basically they sent out packages to numerous Heaven's Gate affiliated companies, people. They sent it out to the BBC department, which was responsible for Louis Theroux's how do you say his name?
Louis Theroux.
Louis Theroux, that's right. Weird Weekends. Basically, they sent out these packages to these people, and it had the tape. It had basically all the tapes in it, and it had just farewell messages. It also contained a letter, and basically just explaining everything that was going on. And one of the people that received this was Rio D'Angelo. So yeah, Rio D'Angelo was a former member, I believe, who they sent the letter and the tapes to. When he saw all of this, he went to the house before contacting the police, and he tried the front door, but it was locked, and he was able to make it around the back door. And he had used a video camera rather, to record what he had found. After he left, the San Diego County Sheriff's Department received an anonymous tip from 911 at 3:15 p.m. on March 26th. This is 2 days later. Basically, this was found out later to be, obviously, D'Angelo. He basically just told them to go to the address, and it's regarding a mass suicide. A single deputy responded first, went to the house, went through the door, and he smelled a pungent odor. And by this time, they had already been decomposing for a couple days, and it was hot outside. It was, Southern California. And, pretty much they left until they can get a search warrant, and came back with a search warrant and found all the bodies, and everyone was dead. Yeah, so that's Heaven's Gate.
Hope you guys liked the episode.
Look, there's a lot we didn't get into. We're trying to fit all of this into like a 45-minute to an hour-long episode, and there's just so much to cover. There's definitely things I wanted to say that I just couldn't or didn't get around to. If you like this, I definitely say go deeper into it and find more out about it. I mean, there's too much as far as internet goes. I mean, you can just rabbit hole forever.
Yeah, if you haven't heard about this, I at least hope we piqued your interest and you'll check out some more stuff on it.
Yeah.
Definitely interesting.
Yeah, but like we said earlier, if you got to this point and if you like what we do, subscribe for us and like the video. It would help us out a lot. Also, again, we have a Patreon for $3 a month. We are about to record some extra content right now for that, and then we'll do it a couple times a month if you want to do it.
And shout out to all of our Patreon subscribers.
Yeah, 7.
Hey, appreciate you guys. That's awesome. We
Yeah.
never thought we'd even get that.
Yeah, it was pretty crazy. 7 in like 4 days or something. I don't know. It's pretty awesome. So thank you very much.
Must be destroyed.
Bye.
Bye.